Most of my research has been done in the temperate zone, actually, but I was already a faculty member at the University of Washington when OTS was founded. And the University of Washington was one of the founding institutions. Yeah. And the university then wanted to get the faculty involved, so the graduate school had a bit of money, and they said any faculty member who wants to go down to Costa Rica to have a look and see whether you could do research there, apply, and we have a little grant. So I applied because I had a sabbatical coming up, and I thought I was teaching ecology and I had no experience with the tropics, and it would probably be a good idea that I developed some understanding. And so I wrote this NSF grant, and the major focus of it was that I would continue my work on blackbirds, but do it in tropical marshes. Ah. It turns out that the red-winged blackbird ranges as a breeding bird from Alaska to northern Costa Rica, which is the end of the range. And so it breeds in the marshes in Guanacaste and in the Los Chiles areas. So I visited the sites and I realized I could do studies of tropical marshes, learn something about how they differed from temperate marshes, and to see the red-winged blackbird in a tropical environment. And so that was the focus of the research proposal. The red-winged breeds in Guanacaste, June to September. So I had 2 breeding seasons with a long time, but then I had a lot of other time to do things with, and I did some other work on community structure of birds in tropical forests and just learning in general about the tropics. Yeah. I did field work in Guanacaste. It was a Finca Taboga. It was a little agricultural station because the Palo Verde station didn't exist then. So I had 2 field seasons, September to the end of August. June to the end of August. And then I had other time during the year, and I learned the birds of Costa Rica and did some censuses of birds in different tropical forests that had been studied by the Tropical Science Center. Uh-huh. They had a big grant from the U.S. military. They wanted to know if they did aerial photos of the forest, what was it like on the ground? And so they had a major contract with Tropical Science Center, Les Holdridge and Company. Mm-hmm. So they did all these measurements on these forests. And so I had a lot of information about the forest, the biodiversity of the trees, etc. And so I was able to do some studies looking at the effects of the different dominance of single or few species of trees and on bird community structure. So I did that as a project during the time of the year when there was nothing going on in Guanacaste. It was dry and the redwings weren't doing anything. So that was my first exposure. Spent that year plus down here. Came down with my family. We rented a house in San Pedro close to the university, threw the kids into school, and I went down and did the research in Guanacaste or other places.
And did that lead to more involvement in the tropics?
It did lead to more involvement, because then 2 years later, in 1969, Dan Jansen and I taught a tropical ecology, advanced tropical ecology course for several months, and that was an intensive course with Dan and I and John Vandermeer as the teaching assistant.
Oh my.
And we had an incredible bunch of students that included many names you will now recognize as leaders in tropical biology that were in that course. And so then I taught that, and then I taught another course in the spring of 1972. Was a very different thing with botanist Derek Birch, of course, Central American pine forests. And so the idea there was we knew a lot about temperate zone pine forests. Here we have tropical pine forests under those climatic conditions. How do those forests compare with the temperate zone
pine forests? Where was that taught?
We taught that course in Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. And we started in the dry season and in Belize, and then ended up there in the rainy season, sort of at the end of the course. So that was a April, May, June course. And so I did some research during that course, and did some research on the way to and from the course or the sabbatical year that I had. So I did bits and pieces, but I never developed from that a long-term research program. But then I was on Gary Hartshorn's thesis committee.
Yes.
And he did the work on Pentaclethra down here. And so we were discussing his thesis and had some interesting ideas. So we wrote a grant proposal, and he became a postdoctoral fellow with me and came down and started working on the tropical forest gaps. And so I did a conceptual paper, and then we surveyed a lot of gaps and ended up with another paper on sort of gap dynamics that you know about since you're a big gap person. So bits and pieces, but I never developed a long-term research program in the tropics. Because my next sabbatical, I went down to Argentina and looked at south temperate marshes.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And then, so you were teaching during the years, and was that after the Tropical Science Center was no longer teaching courses, or what was that involvement there? I know Tropical Science Center was teaching some of the OTS courses sort of around that time, or was that before you were?
That was before, because
okay.
The two courses, the course that Dan Jansen and I taught, and the Pine Forest course, that was strictly OTS.
Okay.
And then much later, of course, I was a visiting professor in a number of courses. I would come down and be one of the 2-week faculty members in a number of courses. And then the last course that I taught for OTS was the Four Forests course that was funded by Mellon Foundation, in which we spent 2 weeks each at La Selva, Barra Colorado Island in Panama, Cochacashu in Peru, and the ecosystems fragmentation site north of Manaus. We spent 2 weeks in each of those, sort of comparing, taking students to the four most intensively studied courses. And that was, I think, 11 years ago, because we were at La Selva on 9/11.
Really?
And I was working in the herbarium that morning, and someone came running in and said, come down to the cafeteria to look at television. I went down and sat for 2 hours watching the television shows of the planes flying into the towers in New York. So that was my last, and I haven't been back to Costa Rica until now since then. For the advanced tropical ecology course that Dan and I taught, as I remember, all of the students had had the fundamentals course beforehand. So they were past the oh my stage. Yeah. They were sort of seasoned.
And these were graduate students?
They were still all graduate students, but they had had tropical experience before and were prepared to go on with sort of advanced stuff. We didn't do the introduction to the tropics then. It was, you already know all that. You've been through that phase, and we're going to look at some interesting tropical ecology issues and focused in on that. So these were experienced students. As I remember less well the students in the Pine Forest course, but most of those had not had tropical experience before, as I remember. The students in the Four Forests course, we made a decision that it would be better to have students that already had finished their dissertations, because I was worried things had gotten very competitive for jobs, etc. Figured if they're writing their theses, every spare moment they're going to be on their computers with their writing their theses. We didn't want that, so we figured they already got their theses, and they're going to be looking more broadly to the future and their future research. That didn't work out too well because they were so concerned about getting jobs that the Forest course became an opportunity to do research. So they were selecting research projects at the Four Forests that they thought they could get research papers out.
Yeah,
so it was a totally different dynamic. And all three of those courses were very, very different in terms of where the students were, where their heads were, where they were expecting to go, what they wanted out of the course. So it changed, and the changes sort of reflected what was going on in general at the universities, how competitive it was for jobs, and how focused you felt you had to be to make it.
Yeah. When did you get involved with the Organization for Tropical Studies?
Well, the University of Washington, of course, was a founding member, and then I did that sabbatical, and then I was, for many, many years, one of the representatives of the University of Washington on the OTS board. So I was coming down every year as for
So
the
you were
meetings.
an active board member.
I was an active board member. The one board meeting I missed was my daughter was graduating from college, and so her college graduation was at the same time as the board meeting, and so I wasn't there. And you may remember you had a role in what happened then. That was the year I was elected president in absentia in a rather circuitous way, which I don't know if posterity needs to know all about that, but. But it was interesting because I was down in Santa Cruz at my daughter's graduation, and we had some people living in our house, and that was before the internet and all of that. And we called back to the house to check on how things going. And said, there's some funny phone calls here, and she told me about them. And one was if you are elected president, will you in fact agree to serve? And then they couldn't get a hold of me. And then the second message was, forget the first message, you have been elected. So I came back from Santa Cruz, California, and suddenly I found I was president of OTS, and I immediately called Don Stone and said, Don, what happened? What am I walking into? And I immediately went down to Duke and spent a few days there to figure out what had happened and what I should try to do. Because I was a graduate student at Berkeley from 1956 to 1960. I got the job at Washington before I had finished my thesis, actually. Things were different in those days.
Yeah.
The number of people that applied for the job I got was 16, if you want to know how much things have changed. So I turned in my thesis and drove to Seattle and had my whole career there at the University of Washington. So yes, I was there when the offices were still in the College of Forest Resources at the University of Washington, and when then it was moved to Duke. I was on the board then, and as you know, OTS almost folded then. There were various problems, including problems with the executive directors that had been hired, and as we all know, Don Stone came in and sort of saved it and brought things back, and things grew back. But I was then, at first just a delegate,
Right.
board member, and then I became president, and those 6 years were very, very dynamic years, and the Board of Visitors was established during that time because we recognized we had a rather unusual board of academics, and the usual functions that a board carries out, of a lot of the fiscal stuff and investments and all of these things that a broad board does. Well, that wasn't the world in which the academics that were on the board lived in. I remember Don Stone telling me that, they were, we have a little money left over. How can we get rid of it right away? I mean, that there was
nonprofit.
There was no sense of how to run this.
Yeah.
From the point of view of the delegates, because they were very good at how to do tropical research, how to run the courses, but the other things. And so we decided to start the Board of Visitors, which we did during that time, and I guess it's been fairly successful and has served that other purpose that what was the only board couldn't possibly serve, because even though sometimes there were administrators, there were university administrators who looked at it from the point of view, how is this affecting my university, not the overall thing of running this major consortium. And there were never what I would call crises in the budget, but the money was always tight, and the major source of discretionary funds was the membership dues. And it has been forever, as far as I can tell, a problem of generating the membership dues at the universities, which has continued.
Yes.
I know when I was there active on the board, I would take some graduate students and go up to the dean of the graduate school and say, here, you tell the dean that why you came to the University of Washington, and it was important that we were members of OTS. But we had to do this. We spent a lot of time, and this was for $10,000. It was a trivial amount of money, and the amount of work that went in, the time that was taken to generate that $10,000 was obscene. Really, it was. But the sort of the semi-crisis that I remember we had while I was president concerned Las Cruces. So we the Wilson Botanical Garden has existed, then OTS took it over. But I forget the name of the president of Costa Rica at the time, but his wife was Canadian. And I don't remember either of their names. But she decided that Las Cruces should be a part of the Patrimonio Nacional. And she kept introducing bills into the legislature for OTS to buy, for the Costa Rican government to buy out OTS. And so every year we were battling, are we still going to have Las Cruces or not? And we're having to muster support. I remember a full-page ad one year was taken out in La Nacion from people from the Coto Bruce area telling the Costa Rican legislature, we think Costa Rica has better things to do with its money than to buy out OTS. We're very happy to have Las Cruces run by OTS. So, but we went through this crisis as long as he was president and she was the president's wife. And then when, of course, they went to the next president, that died. And we sort of breathed a sigh of relief. We don't have to worry about each year, are we still going to have Las Cruces? So that was a rather interesting sort of little mini crisis that we passed every year of, are we going to lose OTS? Or Las Cruces, are they going to buy us out? And it came close, apparently, a couple of times, as I remember. I don't have a 50-year vision. I was, in preparation for the panel that I will be on Thursday, I was trying to think about, what was I thinking 50 years ago? How was I looking at it? What would I have expected? And I didn't have a vision worth anything. And I don't think my crystal ball is any better now than it was then. I don't think I would have anticipated what has happened. The incredible surge of population in Costa Rica that has occurred during this time, the deforestation that we've all seen. When I came down, it was that first map, when Costa Rica was all forest. And very little ag land, some in Guanacaste and not very much. You could not drive to Puerto Limon. Then there was a little railroad that went down the valley of the Rio Reventazón. And I know we went once, took the train down to Limon. It was a sleepy little town. And remember that Puerto Viejo was the port.
Yes.
The ships could come up the river to Puerto Viejo. Stuff was loaded on mule back and carried up over the mountains to San Jose. That was what it was. There was no road to the Atlantic coast. So things have just, absolutely changed dramatically. Whether they're going to change as dramatically during the next 50 years, I haven't a clue. You can't do too much more deforestation. But could there be a dramatic reforestation during? I don't know. I would like to see that, but I have no expectation that it will happen or that it won't. I guess my sense is that some things will not change. The importance of natural history knowledge, I think it will still be absolutely essential to anything. I've sort of been looking at, say, understanding of Lyme disease in the United States and what all went wrong because they didn't know what the ticks were. They didn't know who the major hosts were. They thought they were deer ticks. They thought the deer were the problem. It turns out the deer are a sideshow. There was no notion that there was a connection between the defoliation of the trees and pupae and white-footed mice, deer mice. The whole notion of what drove Lyme disease has depended upon gathering very intensive natural history knowledge. Without that, you wouldn't know what to do. The work that Smithsonian people are doing in Panama, looking at the loss of tree species on the small islands in Gatun Lake. Well, it's easy to see that the loss of trees, understand which trees went under and why. You needed to know who were their pollinators, who were the dispersed the seeds, how they were related to this or that. And so they can understand now and know why the trees that went were gone and why the trees that are there now are thriving. Mm-hmm. But that depended on detailed natural history knowledge of all of those trees and their relationship to all the animals that they were involved with. So I can't see how the problems that we're going to be needing to deal with in the future will not depend on detailed natural history knowledge of all these species. I don't think we're going to have, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think we're going to have in ecology the same sort of thing that occurs in the physical environment where we can get the laws of thermodynamics, and we don't need to know how the individual molecules work. The statistical summation to these major laws work. They don't need to have this knowledge of the individual entities. I don't think biology is like that. I think once you've seen one molecule, you've seen them all, maybe, you know, but all the uniqueness of these interactions of all these organisms, I expect that to be important 10 years from now, 50 years from now. And so the knowledge we generate about them and how we understand what they do, I think will be the foundation of whatever we do in restoration. My view is that restoration ecology is the acid test of our theoretical knowledge. If we know how to do it, we got an understanding. If we screw up on it, it means we haven't got it right. And I believe that restoration ecology is going to fundamentally depend upon a rich, detailed knowledge of natural history of the constituent organism. So in that sense, I'm a very conservative guy, and this may reflect that I'm old now, and you get conservative with age.
Yeah.
But that I think that knowledge will be as important 40, 50 years from now. Just exactly how we'll use it and what our understanding will be, I don't know, because we're still groping in the dark for this. But I think it's going to be biodiversity knowledge as being incredibly important for whatever we try to do in restoration, etc. So I'm a conservative on that, but exactly the restoration problems we're going to have, what we're going to try to do, whether society will have embraced biodiversity and integrated biodiversity preservation into the landscape, and whether this becomes a part of how society works. I hope so, but I don't know. I'll be sad if it isn't, but
Yeah.
you know, I hope that's what it is.